This is Melissa, and it is the 30th of July, 2023, and this Redux is from a talk that Alan did August the 7th, 2013. World core magic creates the tragic nomadic. The culture industry is a potent tool for directing the future. It can fool youth especially into vehicle for change, fits elites' plan to order and rearrange society's new normals, lower expectations, accepting authoritarianism across nations, trained in sync for the new social order, ending sovereignty, scrubbing each border, vast labor forces now are nation-hopping as corporations rise, then go down flopping, or else move where business cost is cheap. The masses accept this without a peep. Blatant corporate mockery of democracy, paid-off politicos full of hypocrisy. I started trying to make an introduction to this several hours ago, and I've recorded in total about an hour and a half. And I finally concede defeat. I will say that I looked into the Aspen Institute more. This week my research led me to what I consider the top of the pyramid of the Aspen Institute. And I realized when I was trying to convey what I had discovered that I lack either the skills or maybe finesse is a better word to put it across. I'm going to address what I've found in writing. There is a point in Alan's talk where he's talking about inflation, and then he got into the money system. He said, and this is the con of this money system and the gangsters and the banksters that run the world, basically. It's run by them. It is run by the banksters at the top. And at the top, there are only a few families at the very top, about 13 families that have been here for centuries actually running the whole system. And also, there are 200 families below them that do most of the investments every day on the stock exchange, and they slush around millions and millions of dollars, massive millions of dollars every day. But anyway, into the system that they've given us is built-in inflation, and then he goes on to talk about inflation. But this is the key point of my discovery of the top of the so-called pyramid of the Aspen Institute, is that I have found most assuredly two of the families in that 200 families below the 13 who do most of the investments and are slushing around a lot of money, and that is the Pritzker family and the Crown family. And what I discovered is eye-opening and very worth investigation. So anyone who wants to follow me down that rabbit hole, please look at the links that I will supply, not on this talk, but in the article that I post, which is not written and not titled, so just look for a not sure piece that accompanies this talk, and I will share a little bit of what I've uncovered about the Pritzker family and the Crown family and their connection to Aspen, the town of Aspen, and the Aspen Institute, and geopolitics. Very, very interesting. Certainly never was a follower of politics, but after this little foray into the Aspen Institute, I can certainly see clearly, very clearly, what a sham politics across all nations are. So again, this is a pyramid, and last week I covered what I now see as the base by the Aspen Ideas Festival and all of the different programs that are funded and the fellowships that run through them and the young leaders and the security fellowship winners and the Aspen Strategy Group with the trustees of the board itself and the Aspen Strategy Group. You get into the middle of the pyramid, but this week I looked into what are the lifetime trustees of the Aspen Institute, and it was there that I realized I was looking at the top of the pyramid, so to speak, of the Aspen Institute. Very interesting. I'll let you read that and follow the links, and perhaps you'll see what I see, and I will leave it at that. I wanted to mention once again the real history that I did with Darren in South Africa and Petrus, who is bringing attention to the farm attacks, and I think that this is something that I want to return to again in that format, but I'm encouraging those of you who listened to that talk or watched the video that I made and were moved by this to support it. I see that he is a third of the way to his stated goal on the Back a Buddy donation crowdfunding system, and the goal is very modest. I certainly think that amongst people who listen to that talk, we can help him achieve that goal. So here is Alan with a very good talk that touches on foundations and how they shape the world that we live in completely, totally. Touches on the Aspen Institute, and then if you're interested, you can read what I'm going to write about these two families. Thank you.
Hi folks, I'm Alan Watt, and this is Cutting Through the Matrix on August the 7th, 2013. For those who are new to the broadcast, you should go into the website cuttingthroughthematrix.com. There's lots of audios for free download, and I take you through the big system that you're born into. The system that's all around you. Everyone accepts it, although they never think their way through it. And they accept it because everyone accepts it. It's simply there, so it must be normal, and therefore you accept it. But really, we're living through a planned society, a global society, by the way. And big plans are made by private organizations, not governments. And these private organizations are far wealthier, of course, than any government, because the foundations they set up at the early 20th century had billions at that time of dollars and pounds in them, and today they're into the trillions of dollars to spend, and they're classified as charitable organizations and philanthropies because they fund big projects across the world, mainly to do with altering the politics across the world and the way we view life in general too. That's set up by the biggest bankers of their time, who formed these agencies, these private clubs, such as the Royal Institute for International Affairs, CFR, and so on. Now they have branches across the whole world which advise governments on all kinds of policies, because these big foundations have the big think tanks too, just like the Rand Corporation. And the Rand Corporation, again, is classed as a charitable institution which charges billions sometimes of dollars for any study on any particular thing. So we're run by private organizations over which we have no control, and we're still given this farce of democracy. Now, the big organizations like the Royal Institute for International Affairs came up with the idea a long time ago to bring in the global society with free trade and the free movement of goods and labor across all borders. And they've set up all the machinery for it, all the legalities have been done, and treaties have been signed by all countries to allow this to happen today. And of course, that's why they bring in all the pluralistic societies, etc., multiculturalism across the world. All of these things are all part of it, all decided by private institutions that drafted up the documents and handed it to the governments, which signed them all through the World Trade Organization and the World Bank. Again, private institutions belonging and set up by the Royal Institute for International Affairs. So it's funny that it's never ever mentioned much in the media, these organizations, because every top reporter for the media and the owners of the media, the big moguls, are all members of this institution as well. They're all on board with the agenda. And the whole idea of that too was to standardize the news across the world. Therefore, you would have no conflicting stories on any particular topic. We'd all get the same indoctrination at the same time. And that's how it works today. And we think it's all normal because we don't know that private organizations have a big agenda. And they run the world like a big business plan with 50-year plans to achieve certain goals, 100-year plans for other ones, just the same as the United Nations, which they also set up. and this old Soviet Union, which also ran on plans, 5, 10, 50 and 100-year plans. So it's hard for the average person to understand this or even believe it, because when you're born into this system, most folk are born on the lower levels of the ladder, and they struggle through life. They actually, sometimes they don't know where they're going in life, because things are so chaotic now with jobs, employment, and future and all the rest of it. It's hard for them to believe that anything is stable in this world, never mind plans that are made and actually are made to happen 50 years down the road. But that's exactly how it really does work, and has worked for a long, long time. So help yourself to the website cuttingthroughthematrix.com. Remember too, you support me along the way by getting the books and discs I have at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. And I go through it all on those books too, because the art of conning the public, and it truly is conology, very old tactic, where ancient priests even understood how to take over the minds of millions of peoples and create empires, and by giving them new religions, etc. And out of that, they gathered all the evidence on how to control people's minds, and lots of them eventually grafted into, you might say, being advisors to the early forms of governments and kings and queens, and right down to the present time of governments too. So these arts are well understood, and the processes of managing great populations are easily understood today. Today, of course, they have also neuroscientists on board, and historians as well as philosophers, by the way. Very important to have them all on board to find out how ancient societies worked up to the present and the tactics they used. But they also used to say the behaviorists and psychologists, neuroscientists, etc., all working to shape the policies for governments to follow. And that's what we live through today. And remember too, the culture industry is a big, big part of this, very important part of this, from the ancient times to the present. Because city societies need lots of entertainment, as Plato said a long time ago, and they become the beehives for change, since they're already in an artificial society. Crammed inside a city is an artificial way of living. Everything must come in to the city to support them, to keep them alive. And they must also use a substitute form of exchange or barter, which they call money. And through money and those who manage the money, they control the cities and eventually the world. Nothing has changed up to the present time. So go through the website, as I say. And to buy the books and discs, remember, from the US to Canada, you can still use personal checks or international postal money orders from the post office, or you can send cash, and straight donations are seriously welcome. As I say, most folk struggle through life. They struggle through life never really knowing for sure where they're headed. And they think that, and they're taught to think too, that crises just appear suddenly out of nowhere, like wars, things like that, and financial crashes on a massive scale. And they've no idea these are planned in years in advance. Years in advance. Lots of evidence to this factor too. But again, that the present media plays along with the politicians and pretends that it's just happening now, and the politicians are there to solve the problems. Remember, the wars to do with Afghanistan, Iraq, and right through the whole of the Arab countries were planned in the 90s at least. They were published back then, before 9/11 happened. A whole list of them was published by the PNAC group in the US, who wanted to take out Iraq, Afghanistan, and Syria and other countries too. So did Israel. They were on board with the same countries to be taken out by the US, and they published it in their own papers too. So we're living through it. Plus the bank crashes as well. The insiders knew for 5 years, at least 5 years. I'm sure it was much, much longer for higher levels, that they crashed the banks in 2008. And it was all arranged, etc., amongst them all, by the way. So we're living through planned changes. Now, when you get into the long-term changes, it's to do with cultural changes. That's the most important part of all, because culture, as I say, is the most important part of controlling societies, changing societies, radically altering their cultures, behavior. It's not just through fashion, etc., sexual mores, everything, even families, etc., all following what was called the Marxist concepts at one time, which was also part of the so-called far-right concepts from the Royal Institute for International Affairs, London, the top bankers, because they themselves wanted to bring in a planned society. And many of them too have talked in their own memoirs about reading Plato's Republic. And in Plato's Republic, he went through the perfect utopia they'd create, where the elite, the intelligentsia, could rule the world properly, and all women would be held in common. Many ways to view that, you understand. If you bring out promiscuity and methods of so they'll never bond for life with a partner and have children, then technically they make their rounds, which means that eventually they get around to most of the guys around them. So all women are in common one way or another. Many ways to achieve your goal, you understand. And they decided, even in the 1920s, that, and before that, from H.G. Wells, in fact, his first book was on free love in the late 1800s. And who was sponsoring him? Well, it was actually Darwin's best friend who picked him up and promoted him into the public limelight as a propagandist. Back with more after this. Hi folks, we're back cutting through the matrix. I've said many times before that people don't realize that the big plans that were made to bring in really the 60s lifestyle in the 1920s, the roaring 20s. In came the miniskirt, the Charlton dance and so on. And they brought in drugs and they made prohibition. They brought that in too at the right time, which made booze cans really sexy and bad. Anything that's bad, youngsters will go into. And of course after that too, they found there's way more people drinking and alcoholics than there was ever before it. So it really started the whole promiscuity thing too. But the one thing they didn't have at the time was contraceptive pills, and they didn't have antibiotics for all the diseases that were spread, and they didn't have all the free abortion clinics too. So there's a lot of fallout from that. So they went back to work. They used the taxpayers' money in every country, and they came out with the contraceptive pill early on. In the 1960s, really gave it out for free, in fact, in some countries. And then brought the same agenda right back in the music, the miniskirts, promiscuity, drugs, and so on. And with the hippie generation, and they got it all going. The intention was, and many writers who really planned this whole culture, like Bertrand Russell talked about it too, that it would help to destroy marriage because it was obsolete now. And government had to become very, very strong and be able to really order in an authoritarian fashion the general public. Families were generally rather large. They stand up against government often when they were picked on, if someone was picked on. And eventually the government would be able to talk right down to the individual with no one standing up for that individual. H.G. Wells talked about it too, and that was their goal. And also you find out that 1984, the movie and the book, 1984 also had that in it too, where you had a screen in your home and government talked right down to you. Now, of course, even in Canada, they're bringing out some kind of USB stick where you can stick in and you have direct communication with government, because eventually government's going to run your life for you directly, and it's all going along in the right agenda, you see. So all culture is altered by those who want to alter it and who have the money, the financing, and they already own the machinery of the culture industry. Very simple, folks, and it doesn't happen by itself. Anybody can be made to be a star today. And in fact, for a long, long time, there's a machinery behind making a star. The talent really is secondary. Often, actually, it's maybe even down in the third place. But anyone can be made a star. And with enough promotion, youngsters will follow that star like crazy. Happens all the time, and it will always happen that way. So they know how to use them. Then you also know what kind of music to bring in too, what the theme of the music will be about. And they promote that as well. And of course the culture is simply monkey see, monkey do, as Darwin said himself. That's what you do with cultures. So you find that we're run by private institutions, as I've said before, organizations we do not elect. And this does away with the whole farce of democracy completely, actually. The government's there to rubber stamp the agenda because all the top politicians are members, again, of the private clubs, like the Royal Institute for International Affairs, Council on Foreign Relations, across the world, by the way. Now, here's an article here to do with Aspen, the Aspen Institute, very important institute, in fact. And you'll find Aldous Huxley's wife was well associated with that institute at the beginning, in fact. And they've done big, big experiments on the population down through the years. If you can dig into them, you'll find them. But here's an article here to do with a schedule on ideas, the Aspen Ideas Festival that went on, I think, in June. And it said, and you have to look at this. I'll put this link up tonight too at cuttingthroughthematrix.com. All of the articles I always do at the end of the night. But it goes through the list of those who attended this. Top directors, musical directors, attended. All the top biggies ones attended it. And they join a group of distinguished conductors as well as artists, community leaders, very important, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, community leaders, and cultural thinkers. For an enlightening conversation about musical citizenship. It says this session is the culminating event of a symposium convened by Harman Eisner, artist in residence, Yo-Yo Ma, on music and community mobilizing in the 21st century. And it gives you a list of the other people who attended, all the biggies, you see. Now what it's about too, it was held, is for a civic rite of passage. Now these are guys all involved in the culture industry, you understand. A civic rite of passage, the case for national service in the US and elsewhere, for the youth, you see. And the generals there from the military, etc., etc. But it says, back at the 2012 Aspen Ideas Festival, General Stanley McChrystal spoke compellingly about how the notion of service had become dangerously narrow, with less than 1% of Americans serving in the military, and challenged us to explore new pathways and opportunities for service to country. Inspired by this call to action, Aspen Institute launched the Franklin Project to envision and create a civic rite of passage for young Americans through a year or more of national service. The session will reflect on some of the big ideas and takeaways from the Franklin Project's 21st Century National Service Summit. As is Stanley E. McChrystal, John Bridgeland, and Alan Casey, Elliot Gershon, and Sidra Bonner attended it too. So they said one nation which is divisible. There's your key, not indivisible. One nation divisible, it says. One of the topics was Principled Pluralism, the report of the Inclusive America Project on America's changing religious landscape. It's to do with multiculturalism, mass immigration from other countries, by the way, which are planned even more so than not just from Latin America, but from outside, like the ones that are going through Europe, and etc. And it says, how do we engage America's religious pluralism as a force for the common good? David Gergen reporting the findings of the new report called Principled Pluralism, report of the Inclusive America Project, prepared by a distinguished panel convened by the Institute's Justice and Society program. Gergen will all describe how America religious diversity is a source of civic engagement and how we can bridge religious differences to build a stronger social fabric. And so on and so on. It's quite a lengthy article, and I'll put this up tonight, and you can see who attended it, the lectures that they gave on it, and so on and so on. Lots of government employees there too. So that's to do with cultural changes, guiding the future through cultural changes. The youth don't know. They always are given things which they think are radical, and they want it's bad, so they always join it, never knowing they're being used. Every generation's been used since at least the 50s. And they don't know it. Even the songs are given to them to follow. Even the dress is given to them to follow. The outfit, that's your sign of being a rebel, you see. It's all done by the fashion industry, which is a part of the cultural industry, of course. But I'll put this up tonight for those that want to go through it. Because culture does not, believe me, nothing comes from the grassroots. If it did, as Plato said all that time ago, the elite would have to squash it, because the elite allow all culture from the top down to take place, not the other way around. It's always been that way. Because with the big plans that there's always in motion, anything from the grassroots could upset a ripple effect through all the plans of the elite, you see. So it's not allowed. It's always squashed. And you can't get funding for it anyway. Also too, big training exercises going on in the US, of course. They do this every year. National Terror Response Training Exercise. That's what they're calling it now, National Terror Response. Before it was Earthquake Responses and so on. Now it's National Terror Responses Training Exercise. And it says thousands of members of the armed forces, including members of the Indiana National Guard, were participating in mass disaster trainings in Jennings County, called Exercise Vibrant Response, is in full effect at the Muscatatuck training camp in Cap Atterbury in Johnson County. 5,000 members of the military and civilians from across the country taking part in a 2-week large-scale disaster response exercise. One of the scenarios is a nuclear terrorist attack in Columbus, Ohio, and the backdrop is as close to the real thing as it gets. They've got all the medical mannequins, which they used to blow up, of course, in the H-bomb and A-bomb tests. And 300 live role players are part of the exercise. They also bring amputees in all the time. I remember I read the article a while back after the Boston bombings, and they bring real amputees in on these exercises. And I'll continue with this after these messages. Hi folks, we're back cutting through the matrix. Tonight I'll also put up an article and a link to about vibrant response from the United States Army's own website, if you want to read that too. And also too, we know that the smart grid is not, everything's international, remember. Everything they tell you about today, even the con job that they got massive financing in Britain for their fracking industry, massive financing in the US for their fracking industry. And the whole idea and the propaganda at the time was, we'll have 100 years of natural gas for our use at home. Once they get it all up and working, the first thing they do is start exporting it, folks. That's what they do. And they've done it, actually. So we're conned at every turn. So it's the same with the smart grid, too. It isn't just a spy mechanism. It's also a system where they can turn off certain sections and areas and countries, or the whole country if they wanted to. And eventually be a global system of a global grid. I put the articles up before from IBM about the smart global grid. And again, private companies do these things and go along with it, too. And you still see we're living in democracies. We've had no say in anything at all. But anyway, the Smart Grid Advancement Act is introduced in US Congress. Take action to stop it today. I'll put this link up tonight because there's people protesting it, and you can get in on the act as well. But it says 2 members of Congress, it was Jerry McNerney and Matt Cartwright, Democrat, have introduced a congressional bill, H.R. 2685, that apparently require all electricity providers, including rural co-ops and municipal utilities, to join the smart grid and install smart meters. Now, the smart meters, too, remember, you got extra cash when you pay. I mean, you pay extra cash for having the meter in because it's a private company that does the automatic readings from it. And then, so now you've got another party involved, along with the suppliers and so on. So your prices go up and up and up. It's all for profit, etc. So I'll put this article up tonight, and you can have a good look at this. It's quite a good website actually. But it's called Stop Matters. It's Stop Smart Meters, I should say. And it's worthwhile a read and get involved if you can. Also, 40% of US workers make less than what a full-time minimum wage worker made back in 1968. And it's said here that American workers are paid enough. That's a topic that's endlessly debated all across the great land and so on. Unfortunately, what pretty much everyone can agree on is that American workers are not making as much as they used to make after you account for inflation. Back in 1968, the minimum wage in the US was $1.60 an hour. It says that sounds very small, but after you account for inflation, a very different picture emerges. Using the inflation calculator that the Bureau of Labor Statistics provides, $1.60 in 1968 is equivalent to $10.74 today. And then this is the con of this money system and the gangsters and the banksters that run the world, basically. It's run by them. It is run by the banksters at the top. And the top, it's only a few families at the very top, but 13 families. They've been here for centuries, actually, running the whole system. And also there's 200 families below them that do most of the investments every day on the stock exchange. And they slush around millions and millions of dollars, massive millions of dollars every day. But anyway, that's into the system that they've given us is built-in inflation. Every year things go up. And you think it's all quite natural, it goes up. And you expect a pay raise every year too, to cope with it. And that's how it is. But you take it back in, say Britain too, even in the 70s, someone on £7 a week could get through quite well. Now it's hundreds of pounds for the same thing to try to get through a week. But this is so you've got built-in inflation in every system. Everywhere you have a centralized private bank, you've got built-in inflation. Simple as that. It's built into the system until you end up like the peso or the lira, and you spend thousands a lira for a cup of coffee. But of course, the official government inflation numbers have been heavily manipulated to make inflation look much lower than it actually is. So the number for today should actually be subsequently higher than $10.74. But for purpose of this article, we'll use $10.74. Well, you also have to factor in too, taxes go up and up and up as well. And the prices of everything goes up too, with the cost of living. Says this isn't a lot of money, but according to the Social Security Administration, 40.28% of all workers make less than $20,000 a year in America today. So that means that more than 40% of all US workers actually make less than what a full-time minimum wage worker made back in 1968. That's how far we have fallen. And it's true. It's very, very true. There's many articles out too over the years talking about the fact that wages haven't risen in the last 20 odd years. And even the starting wages in Canada are pretty well what they were 20 years ago for most jobs at the bottom. They haven't gone up. So it's planned that way by those at the top, of course. And as they go into a certain phase of mass inflation, basically, which will come along when they collapse the system, when it's time, then bring in the new system, which is planned too, into austerity, then they'll give you a new way of living altogether. Also, too, with the Royal Institute for International Affairs, they brought in the whole idea of free trade. They gave us the World Trade Organization because we didn't put it in. We didn't get to vote on it. They gave you the IMF, the World Bank, and the Bank for International Settlements. They own them all. They decide to say there'd be lots of bankruptcies across the world eventually, and they would use the bankruptcies to bring in the foreign countries and foreign investors that actually buy up parts, whole chunks of the lands. In fact, they're doing it in England. Parts of the coast have been sold off to French companies and so on. And even the companies based in France are not really French at all. So you can't just blame it on the countries where the company happens to be located. So there's so many con games going on, you have to really dig through it. But anyway, China cashes in on Bankrupt Detroit. Well, that was planned years ago. And it says Detroit's filing for bankruptcy on June 18th was a culmination of decades of progressive politics and corruption. Detroit is a very high-profile example of some of the challenges our cities continue to face. And it says, Kel Hughes, an analyst who tracks local finances for Pew Charitable Trust. It says Detroit, in Detroit, governments are living beyond their means, and they're going to eventually have to pay the piper. Well, the public always pays the piper, as you all know, and all the mafia that runs the cities too. It says the time to pay the piper has indeed finally arrived for Detroit. And the question is, how will the piper be paid? Some are calling for another federal bailout, but President Obama and Treasury Secretary Jack Lew, sensing the American taxpayers are in no mood for mass payouts for deadbeats, have declared there will be no bailout for the beleaguered city, at least not a direct bailout. However, the plan seems to be for Detroit and other cities in the same predicament to obtain an indirect bailout by transferring their bloated, unfunded public union pension plans to Obamacare. Interesting, eh? This would mean, of course, that the taxpayers would be stuck for billions of dollars that the city's Democratic politicians promised to the union activists and welfare drones in exchange for their votes. Another alternative poison pill being promoted as a magical panacea: let China buy Detroit and all the other bankrupt U.S. counties and municipalities. With hordes of cash and more than $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury securities, Communist China's state-owned enterprises can scoop up big chunks of distressed American real estate for pennies. Literally, many of Detroit's 78,000 abandoned buildings can be had for $1. The fire sales have been underway for some time, and the Beijing regime is already a major buyer. Dozens of companies from China are putting down roots in Detroit, part of the country's steady push into the American auto industry. The New York Times reported May 12th that the Chinese-owned companies are investing in American businesses and new vehicle technology, selling everything from seatbelts to shock absorbers in retail stores, and hiring experienced engineers and designers in an effort to soak up the talent and expertise of domestic automakers and their suppliers, the Times continued. While starting with batteries and auto parts, the spread of Chinese business is expected to result eventually in the sale of Chinese cars in the United States. But of course the Chinese also bring in their own workers too, in most countries. And you understand too, there are certain free trade zones within the countries. These are pretty well sovereign zones, by the way. They were set up a long time ago by FDR in the US. That's how far back it goes. Where they can import stuff directly into that particular area, bypass all customs and everything. That's been going on since the 30s. I'm trying to get it through to people that these are long-term goals and plans, folks, by one organization that's going to go your whole lives, and your parents' lives and grandparents' lives. And most folk are oblivious to this. So anyway, that's the one about China, and it goes on and on, of course. about the different Shanghai auto shows and so on. They're promoting moving to other parts of the world and their big businesses too, etc., and the fire sales they can get in the US. And remember too, those who signed all the agreements for the World Trade Organization and all the Western countries knew darn well that once your factories were to go up and move, which was a big plan, of course, move them all, and use the tax money to fund the moving of them all, which they did, and still do if you want to move over to China, then, of course, there was nothing left at home. They knew all that. They knew all this stuff. It didn't come as a surprise to them. The big think tanks work everything out step by step, what's going to happen about this, and so on and so on. Also, a record 21 million young adults now live with their parents, it says. And a year ago, we questioned the demographic demand thesis for why the U.S. housing recovery would become self-sustaining and lead to yet another fiscal monetary nirvana. However, while the household formation meme remains front and center amongst bloviating Fed apologists, the fact is only that most folk are actually staying with their parents now. There's no homes out there. It talks about the nirvana that's going to happen in housing and self-sustaining and recovery and all the rest of it would happen after the last crash. And of course, it hasn't happened at all. And a recent Pew Research study finds out that 21 million young adults are now living at home with their parents. Then they go into other countries too and compare them all. And I think there's 1/3 of young people all live with their parents. In Italy, for instance. I understand that because there's no cooking like mums, obviously, in Italy. But in other countries, it's really a different matter altogether. And it's so hard and expensive even to get apartments now for young people, especially if you're just getting low-level jobs stacking shelves and things in supermarkets or whatever. So this is a trend across the world as we get trained into austerity. And believe you me, the organizations I talk about, like the CFR and so on, did studies 40 years ago on this coming situation. It's not happening by chance at all. None of it is. None at all. If you run the world and you run the world, you always plan the world to make sure that those at the top continue to be at the top and their offspring too. That's why they get richer and richer and richer with every generation. But they get more powerful too. And they're not going to share that power, of course, and they're internationalists at the top, always have been. And that's their plan for the future for the rest of you, is to go down the tubes, of course. I've read the book on the air, some of the parts of the book by Jack Satali, who is a big shot at the United Nations, and he knows what the whole agenda too, and he put out the book. It was called Millennium. And that was back in the 90s, and he brought it in, and he said about the winners and losers in the coming New World Order. And he said the next boat people will be US citizens leaving, looking for work abroad. And that's already happening, of course. Also, this article too, I'll put up tonight, to do with the new normals, of course, of police states, basically. That's what we're in. We're all in police states now. Armed police storm a couple's house and hold them for 4 hours after mistaking a TV remote for a gun. And it says Michael Malone and Keith Abrams are suing police after 18 armed officers arrested them following reports they had a gun, which turned out to be a remote control. They were in their bed at the time. And it said that 10 armed officers wearing body armor along with 8 uniformed police and a dog handler busted into their home and their flat at 1 a.m. in the morning. They were taken from their home in Hereford and put in a cell where they were quizzed by a detective for 4 hours. 4 hours. I mean, how long does it take for them to go through an apartment? And how long does it take to discover a remote was there? As a remote they had in their hands, even when they bust in. So this is how they work it. The police also conducted forensic fingertip searches of the property after paramedics who visited the previous day wrongly suspected Mr. Abraham was holding a firearm. The paramedics should get his eyes tested, eh? Maybe he should stop taking the drugs he's got in his van, you know. Police had to respond to a report by a paramedic who had attended the house earlier that evening after Michelle suffered a panic attack. Most folk in panic attacks now, folks, is because of the medication the National Health Service is dishing out by the bucket loads as they drug the people into almost unconsciousness to get them through all the bad times. But it says the paramedic believed he'd spotted Keith holding a firearm in the bedroom. But Michelle, 46, explained how Keith, 44, had been watching TV in bed at the time of the medic's visit, and the only thing he'd been holding at the time was a remote control. How could you mistake that? Eh? How could you mistake that? But this is the new normal, as 18 cops turn up, all fully armed and the whole bit, and just smash your place, and that's it. And drag you out. Under this perpetual war on terrorism. This become the normal. And all these TV shows again with the culture industry, drama series about it, ongoing. As we get conditioned, it's all quite normal. It's just like the movie Brazil by Terry Gilliam. It's really worth watching. It's a comedy, but it shows you the future then, and that's how it even starts off in the movie, about the raid on a home, mistaken identity and all the rest of it. It's a lot of little clues in that movie, actually. It's well worth watching. Also, banks now are threatening to punish cities that use eminent domain to help homeowners whose houses are underwater, right? Roughly half the homeowners in the Bay Area of Richmond are underwater on mortgages, but city officers have come up with a plan to float them to safety, which to the concentration of banks and other moneyed interests. The city is strongly considering using the power of eminent domain to seize the homes which are worth less than the amount owed on the mortgage and sell them back to the owners at fair market prices. Richmond, a poor city by most measurements, has not benefited much by the recent surge in housing prices, and many of the homeowners owe 3 or 4 times as much as the home is worth, according to New York Times. I understand the real estate market too. 40 or 50 years ago, people would buy the home from the homeowners who had them. And you went to a lawyer and you made the deal yourself. Now once the real estate agencies got in, now they've got a big conglomeration of like a big system, a club if you like of real estate. They rigged the whole market along with the bankers and jacked all the prices up. Everything's a racket, folks, when it comes to money. Big money. Anyway, it says that we're the first city in the nation to use eminent domain in this fashion, but they aren't allowed, they certainly aren't the only city that would benefit immensely from this strategy. A lot of cities with low-income minority populations were sold a ton of predatory loans that shouldn't have been offered in the first place, and the Times says that at least 24 are actively considering the move. I'll put this one up too for those who want to see it. It's not actually water. It just means that they're under a massive mountain of debt for homes that aren't even worth the price. Again, thanks to the banksters who kept inflating the prices and selling them off to other companies, bank after bank after bank. And they knew what they were doing. But they won't change the systems, folks, won't change them. Because see, way above those banks are the top ones that own it all. It's their system you're living in. Also, a Chinese firm paid an insider to kill his company, American CEO says. And it says federal prosecutors have charged Chinese firm Sinovel with stealing U.S. intellectual property. Sinovel has denied wrongdoing. NBC News national investigative correspondent Michael Isikoff reported a Chinese energy firm offered big money to access to women to entice and engineer a U.S. company to launch a cyber raid on its employer, stealing sensitive computer codes and thereby cheating the firm. That's just industrial sabotage. Espionage, out of more than $800 million, according to newly unsealed court documents, internal messages and emails obtained by the NBC News. And they call the alleged cyber theft from the American superconductor AMSC in Devens, Massachusetts, one of the most brazen cases of Chinese economic espionage in the United States. Techniques the Chinese used to rob the company of 3/4 of its revenue, half its workforce, and more than $1 billion in market value were straight out of a spy novel, the firm's CEO said in an interview with the NBC News. It's funny because last month I read the articles about, I think it was GlaxoSmithKline, that were bribing people over in China to take on all their drugs and offering them all the same kind of things. This is standard big business, folks. There's nothing honest in business, and there's no honest businessmen up there. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. Also, at its meeting on 26th of June, the European Council, this is this big new Soviet system that Marx predicted would come in. It says, and it was formed and set up by the Royal Institute for International Affairs. The European Council reached a joint position regarding how to intervene in insolvent banks in the future, supported by the European Parliament, which has no power at all, This agreement will offer strong protection for retail depositors, although it will not completely break the loop between the bank risk and sovereign risk. The Council has ratified the use of the bail-ins, that's stealing the depositors' money, as far as from 2018 as a main instrument to recapitalise such banks. Sharing losses amongst bank creditors as a previous step before injecting public money. Up to 2018, a similar system to the one in Spain will be used, which the European Commission will specify before August. And then they give you the order of seniority as to who gets paid when the banks collapse. And it gives you all the top ones, and then all the ones at the bottom, the ordinary folk who are plundered. All the private companies and so on will get paid off, or they're okay to get their money out. But all the private people at the bottom are to be scalped, and their money is to be stolen by the banks. And it's now legal to steal your money by the banks, by this ruling. Now it says 2018, we'll start it, but actually it's 2015. And even Canada signed on to do the same thing too for 2015. Quite a system we live in, eh? But they won't change it, folks. It's never worked, but they won't change it. Because you see, they run the world as big boys at the top. And they won't give up that kind of power. Why should they? Power never gives itself up. But the system you're living in is the one they gave to you. Your reality is the one they gave to you. And you think it's normal. From Hamish, myself, Ontario, Canada, is good night to me. Your God or your gods go with you.